She could have chosen comfort. She could have lived a peaceful life, surrounded by safety, stability, and familiar faces. A life of quiet routines, gentle mornings, and predictable tomorrows. A life where faith was practiced in private and sacrifice was optional. But Amy Carmichael was never meant for ordinary paths. From the earliest days of her life, there was something unmistakably different about her spirit. A deep sensitivity to suffering, a restless compassion that refused to stay silent, and a longing for meaning far beyond personal success. Born in Ireland in 1867, Amy grew up in a Christian home, where faith was not just a tradition, but a living devotion. Her parents taught her that Christianity was not merely about belief, but about surrender, obedience, and love in action. Even as a child, Amy noticed the pain that others ignored. When she walked the streets, she saw not just buildings and faces, but hidden stories, poverty, loneliness, and forgotten souls. Where many saw inconvenience, she saw opportunity. Where others passed by, she stopped. And in those small moments of kindness, a larger calling began to quietly take root. One afternoon, as a young girl, Amy encountered a group of poor factory workers, exhausted from long hours of labor. Their faces were marked by fatigue and hardship. Something stirred deeply within her. She gathered what little money she had and began helping them, organizing small acts of compassion and support. It was a simple gesture, but it revealed the direction her life would eventually take. As Amy grew older, her love for God only intensified. She spent long hours in prayer, reading scripture, and seeking clarity about her purpose. While many young women of her time dreamed of marriage, social standing, and comfort, Amy dreamed of obedience. Her heart longed not for recognition, but for surrender. And slowly, a whisper began to form within her soul, a call. It was faint at first, an uneasy sense that her life belonged somewhere else, among people she had never met, in lands she had never seen. But over time, that whisper became impossible to ignore. Amy felt drawn to foreign missions, to places where Christ was unknown, where hope was fragile, and where suffering was constant. Yet, the cost of that calling was overwhelming. To follow it meant leaving behind everything she knew, her family, her homeland, her culture, and every sense of security she possessed. It meant embracing uncertainty, danger, and isolation. It meant stepping into a world where disease, persecution, and loneliness were constant companions. For many, that price was simply too high. But not for Amy. With quiet determination, she committed her life fully to God's will, no matter where it led. In her journal, she once wrote words that revealed the depth of her surrender. "I will go wherever He sends me, no matter the cost." And God took her at her word. Her journey into missionary life began in Japan. There, she encountered an entirely new world, unfamiliar language, unfamiliar customs, and spiritual barriers unlike anything she had known before. The challenges were relentless. Communication was difficult. Cultural misunderstandings were constant. Loneliness often pressed heavily upon her heart. Yet, even in these struggles, Amy refused to retreat. She immersed herself in the culture, learning the language, studying local customs, and building genuine relationships. She did not come as a conqueror or reformer, but as a servant. Her goal was not to impose, but to love. And through that love, she began to see hearts slowly open. But just as her mission in Japan began to bear fruit, her health began to fail. Severe illness forced her to leave the country and return home. For Amy, this was devastating. It felt like failure, like a broken promise. She wrestled deeply with God, questioning whether she had misunderstood her calling. But what she could not yet see was that Japan had only been preparation. A few years later, another door opened, one that would define the rest of her life. India. In 1895, Amy Carmichael arrived on the shores of southern India, unaware that this land would become her home for the next 56 years, and the stage for one of the most extraordinary stories of courage, sacrifice, and faith the world would ever witness. India was beautiful, ancient, and deeply spiritual. But beneath its vibrant colors and sacred rituals lay a reality far darker than Amy had imagined. Poverty was everywhere. Disease ravaged entire communities. Children wandered the streets, abandoned and forgotten, but most disturbing of all was a hidden system of exploitation that few dared to confront. Young girls were being sold into temple service, a practice falsely disguised as religious devotion. These children, some as young as 6 years old, were offered to temples under the pretense of spiritual honor. In reality, they were trapped in cycles of abuse, exploitation, and lifelong captivity. Most missionaries avoided speaking openly about it. The cultural and religious complexities were immense. Intervening meant provoking hostility, legal consequences, and sometimes violent retaliation. But Amy could not look away. Her heart broke as she listened to whispered stories from frightened children, stories of stolen childhoods, of broken innocence, of silent suffering. One evening, as she walked through a village, a small girl ran toward her, clinging desperately to her clothes. The child trembled in fear, her eyes filled with silent pleas. That moment would mark a turning point in Amy's life. From that day forward, she knew her mission. She would rescue these children, no matter the cost. What followed was a life of relentless sacrifice. Amy began secretly sheltering endangered girls, hiding them from temple authorities and powerful religious leaders. She established safe homes where rescued children could heal, learn, and grow in safety. Each rescue came with enormous risk. Threats became frequent. Hostility escalated. At times, armed men searched for the children she protected. Yet Amy never backed down. She disguised herself in Indian clothing, dyed her skin to blend in, and adopted local customs so she could move unnoticed. She learned languages, built secret networks, and traveled dangerous roads to reach children in desperate need. Her life became a constant race against time. Every rescue was a miracle, every night brought danger, and every morning demanded renewed courage. But even as her ministry grew, her physical health deteriorated. A severe accident left her permanently injured, confining her to bed for long periods. Chronic pain became her daily companion. Many assumed her work was finished, but Amy refused to surrender. From her sickbed, she continued leading her ministry, writing letters, organizing rescues, guiding workers, and praying relentlessly. Her physical weakness became the stage for God's greatest strength. Over the decades, Amy Carmichael rescued more than 1,000 children, 1,000 lives spared from unimaginable suffering, 1,000 futures restored, 1,000 testimonies of what unwavering obedience can accomplish. She never married, never sought fame, never returned to her homeland. India became her family. The rescued children became her sons and daughters, and her legacy became one of the most powerful examples of sacrificial love the Christian world has ever known. Amy once wrote, "You can give without loving, but you cannot love without giving." Her entire life proved those words true. She gave her comfort, she gave her safety, she gave her health, she gave her dreams, and in return she gave the world hope. But her greatest battles, both external and internal, were still ahead. Because when you choose obedience over comfort, the cost is never small. And for Amy Carmichael, the greatest tests of her faith were only just beginning. And before we begin, if stories of faith, sacrifice, and transformation inspire you, stay with us, subscribe now, and become part of a community that shares real stories of courage and devotion. Leave your like. It helps this message reach more hearts around the world. And share this video, because someone you know may desperately need this story today. Every story you watch helps keep these testimonies alive. Every like pushes this mission forward, and every share spreads light into darkness. Now let's begin. What Amy had seen in the temples of India refused to leave her mind. During the day, she walked through villages, observing silent faces, cautious gestures, and eyes filled with unspoken fear. At night, she wept in prayer, asking God for strength, wisdom, and courage. Every story she heard revealed a reality more brutal than she could have imagined. Young girls were being taken from their families under the promise of spiritual honor. Mothers were told their daughters would serve the gods, that they would bring blessing upon their homes. In many communities, this practice was seen as a sacred privilege. But behind the closed doors of the temples lay a hidden nightmare. These children were stripped of their childhood, their innocence, and their freedom. They lived in captivity, forced into lives of exploitation, unable to escape, unable to speak, unable to hope. Some were barely old enough to understand what was happening to them. When Amy fully grasped the depth of this system, something inside her broke. She knew that silence would make her complicit, yet confronting this reality meant challenging centuries-old traditions, powerful religious authorities, and deeply rooted cultural structures. It meant risking her reputation, her safety, and possibly her life. Still, Amy chose to act. The first major rescue came unexpectedly. A frightened young girl named Preena escaped from a temple and fled to Christians in the area. When Amy met her, she saw terror mixed with fragile hope in the child's eyes. Preena clung to her, trembling, afraid that at any moment she might be dragged back. Amy took her in, but hiding a rescued child in that society was incredibly dangerous. If discovered, Amy could be accused of kidnapping, imprisoned, expelled from the country, or worse. But she did not hesitate. Soon another girl arrived, then another, and another. Each rescue increased the risk. Rumors spread quickly. Temple authorities grew suspicious. Local leaders accused her of destroying tradition. Some branded her an enemy of religion. Threats followed. Armed men searched nearby villages. Crowds gathered outside her home. Anonymous warnings promised violent consequences. Yet Amy refused to surrender. To protect the children, she established hidden safe houses, simple homes scattered across remote villages where rescued girls could live in safety. There, they received food, medical care, education, and love. For many, it was the first time they had ever experienced kindness. Within those walls, laughter slowly replaced fear, songs replaced silence, hope replaced despair. These shelters eventually grew into what became known as the Dohnavur Fellowship, a sanctuary dedicated to rescuing, healing, and raising vulnerable children. Over time, it became a beacon of light in the darkness of exploitation, but every step forward came with increasing opposition. Legal challenges multiplied. Authorities issued warnings. Angry crowds threatened invasion. On several occasions, mobs marched toward her compounds, demanding the children be returned. Amy and her team gathered in prayer, fully aware that violence could erupt at any moment. Still, she stood firm. Her courage did not come from recklessness, but from deep conviction. She believed those children belonged to God, and that no earthly power had the right to claim them. One day, when confronted by officials, Amy calmly declared, "These children are not property, they are souls." That statement echoed like a direct challenge to an entire system, and the cost of that courage was severe. Years of exhaustion, malnutrition, and illness began to take their toll. Tropical diseases weakened her body. Constant stress drained her strength. Eventually, a serious fall caused permanent injuries, leaving her partially disabled. From that moment forward, Amy would spend much of her life confined to a bed. For many, that would have meant the end of their mission. But for Amy, it became a new chapter of surrender. From her bed, she continued to lead. She wrote letters, coordinated rescues, trained workers, counseled missionaries, and prayed relentlessly. Her physical weakness became a platform for extraordinary spiritual strength. It was during this season that she wrote many of her books and poems, words that would travel across the world, inspiring millions with their depth, honesty, and faith. Her writings carried the weight of suffering, hope, and total dependence on God. Meanwhile, the number of rescued children continued to grow, hundreds, then more. Each new face represented a life pulled back from darkness. But it also meant greater responsibility. Resources were constantly scarce. Food, medicine, clothing, and funds were never guaranteed. Amy lived in near exhaustion, often sleeping only a few hours each night, surrounded by endless needs and impossible demands. Yet time and again, provision arrived in miraculous ways. Unexpected donations, strangers moved to give, supplies appearing at the last moment. To Amy, these moments were reminders that God was actively sustaining the work. But the greatest test was still ahead, because prolonged suffering does something profound to the human soul. It strips away illusions, it exposes hidden fears, it challenges even the strongest faith. And for Amy, the years of confinement, pain, and limitation would lead her into the deepest spiritual battle of her life, a battle that would reshape her understanding of obedience, surrender, and divine love. For when comfort disappears and strength fades, what remains is not performance, but faith. And it was in this valley that Amy Carmichael would discover the most powerful truths of her entire journey. Pain became Amy Carmichael's constant companion. What began as occasional weakness slowly turned into relentless physical suffering. Her injuries never fully healed. Infections returned again and again. Nights were often sleepless, filled with aching muscles, burning nerves, and overwhelming exhaustion. Days brought little relief. Even the smallest movement could trigger waves of pain that left her breathless. And yet, she endured. Confined to her bed for long stretches of time, Amy faced a battle far more intense than any external threat she had ever known, the battle within. For years, her life had been marked by action, rescues, journeys, danger, movement, purpose expressed through tireless labor. Now suddenly she was still, and in that stillness she wrestled. There were moments when silence felt unbearable, moments when loneliness pressed down like a crushing weight, moments when she wondered if her most effective years were behind her, if her life, once so full of movement and urgency, had now been reduced to waiting for strength, waiting for healing, waiting for answers. Yet in those silent hours, God began to reshape her understanding of obedience. Amy slowly realized that surrender was not only about action, it was also about acceptance. She began to understand that faith is not proven only in bold deeds, but also in quiet endurance, not only in visible sacrifice, but in unseen suffering. And so, from her bed, she built a new ministry. Her pen became her voice. Unable to travel, she poured her heart into writing. Day after day, through pain and weakness, she filled pages with reflections, prayers, poetry, and spiritual insight. Her words were raw, honest, and deeply intimate. Forged in the furnace of suffering, she wrote about obedience, about surrender, about the cost of true discipleship, about trusting God when answers remain hidden. Her writings traveled far beyond India, reaching churches, missionaries, and believers across the world. In distant lands, people who would never meet her found strength, comfort, and conviction through her words. While her body lay still, her influence multiplied, but suffering continued to test her faith. There were seasons when God felt painfully silent. Prayers seemed to echo unanswered. Healing did not come. Relief did not arrive. And yet, Amy refused to let bitterness take root. Instead, she leaned deeper into trust. In her private journal, she wrote words that revealed the depth of her surrender. In acceptance lieth peace. These 4 words became the foundation of her spiritual life. Acceptance did not mean resignation. It meant trust. It meant believing that God's purposes were unfolding, even when they could not be understood. It meant resting in His sovereignty, even when the path was steep and painful. During these years, the children of Dohnavur became her greatest comfort. Though she could no longer walk among them as before, they gathered around her bed, reading scripture, singing hymns, sharing stories and laughing together. They called her Amma, Mother, and she truly was. To hundreds of children, she was not a missionary. She was family. She taught them to pray. She taught them to forgive. She taught them to hope. And most of all, she taught them to love Christ with their whole hearts. Her room became a place of worship, a place of counsel, a place of tears, a place of healing. Even while suffering, Amy continued to give, but the weight of decades of sacrifice began to show. As the years passed, her health deteriorated further. Mobility became increasingly limited. Pain grew more intense. Isolation deepened, and yet her spirit grew stronger. In suffering, she discovered a profound intimacy with God. She wrote often about the closeness she felt to Christ in pain, a closeness she had never known in seasons of strength. In her weakness, she learned to cling to Him moment by moment, breath by breath. She came to understand suffering not as abandonment, but as fellowship. Fellowship with the suffering Christ. This perspective transformed everything. Her writings took on a depth and authority that could only come from lived experience. She did not write as a theorist. She wrote as one who had walked through darkness and found God faithful within it. Her words challenged comfortable Christianity. They confronted shallow faith. They called believers to deeper surrender. One of her most powerful prayers became famous across Christian communities. "Make me thy fuel, flame of God." It was a prayer of total abandonment, a willingness to be consumed for His purposes, even in weakness, even in pain, even in obscurity. While her physical world grew smaller, her spiritual influence expanded beyond measure. Missionaries carried her books into distant lands. Pastors preached her words. Believers clung to her prayers. Her testimony became a lighthouse for those navigating their own storms. Yet through all this, Amy remained deeply humble. She never sought recognition. She avoided publicity. She refused honors. She wanted no attention for herself, only that Christ be seen. Even late in life, when her name became widely known, she requested that no monument be built for her. Instead, she asked that a simple birdbath be placed in Dohnavur with a single word engraved upon it, Amma. Nothing more, just Mother. But her greatest legacy was not her writing, it was not her fame, it was not her sacrifice. It was the lives she saved. By the end of her life, more than 1,000 children had been rescued, protected, educated, and given a future. 1,000 stories of redemption, 1,000 lives reclaimed, 1,000 souls touched by radical obedience. And yet Amy never measured success by numbers. She measured it by faithfulness. Her question was never, "How much did I accomplish?" It was always, "Was I obedient?" As her strength faded in her final years, she spent more time in prayer than ever before. Those close to her said her room felt filled with peace. Even as her body weakened, her eyes still shone with quiet joy. She had no regrets, no bitterness, no longing for what might have been. Her life had been poured out completely, and she was at rest. But the story of Amy Carmichael does not end with her final breath, because her legacy continues. Every child she rescued carried her story forward. Every book she wrote continues to speak. Every prayer she whispered still echoes. Her life stands as a question to every generation. What are you willing to give? What are you willing to surrender? What does obedience truly mean? Amy chose the harder road. She chose sacrifice over safety. She chose obedience over comfort. She chose Christ again and again, no matter the cost. And through that choice, she changed thousands of lives and left a testimony that still burns brightly across the world. Yet there is one final chapter to her story, a chapter not of suffering, but of victory, a moment that reveals the eternal impact of a life fully surrendered. And it is in that final moment that Amy's journey reaches its greatest meaning. As the years passed, Amy Carmichael's world slowly grew quieter. The once tireless missionary who had crossed oceans, climbed mountains, and walked endless village paths now lived mostly within the walls of her small room. Her body had become fragile, her strength limited, yet her spirit burned brighter than ever. From her bed, she watched generations of rescued children grow into adulthood. Girls who had once arrived trembling in fear now stood tall with dignity. Many became teachers, caregivers, nurses, and missionaries themselves. Some married, built families, and raised children in safety, a future that would have been impossible without Amy's intervention. Every transformed life became a living testimony, and in each face, Amy saw the faithfulness of God. She often asked to hear their stories. She wanted to know how they were serving, how they were loving, how they were walking with Christ. And as they spoke, tears frequently filled her eyes, not tears of sorrow, but of overwhelming gratitude, because every life redeemed reminded her that no sacrifice had been wasted. Yet, while others celebrated her legacy, Amy remained deeply humble. She resisted praise, she avoided attention, she refused to be called a hero. To her, she was simply a servant. In her writings, she often warned against seeking recognition, reminding believers that true service happens in hidden places, where only God sees. She believed that obedience, not applause, was heaven's true reward. As her health continued to decline, those closest to her noticed a growing stillness, not of weakness, but of peace. She spoke less, prayed more, listened more, and waited. She knew her journey was nearing its end, but there was no fear, no regret, only quiet expectancy. One evening, as soft light filtered through her window, Amy whispered words that summarized her entire life. "When I consider the cross of Christ, how can anything be too much to give?" Those who heard her knew they were standing in the presence of a soul completely surrendered. Her final years became a sacred season, not marked by productivity, but by presence. Presence with God, presence with those she loved, presence in quiet worship, and even in her weakness she continued to shape lives. Missionaries traveled from distant lands to seek her counsel. Pastors wrote to her for guidance. Believers sent letters describing how her books had transformed their faith. From her small room in southern India, Amy Carmichael continued to influence the global church, and still she desired none of the attention. Her deepest longing was that Christ alone would be exalted. As her strength faded, she gave simple instructions: no monuments, no statues, no grand memorials. Instead, she requested that a simple bird bath be placed in Dohnavur, engraved with just one word: Amma, Mother. Nothing more, because that was how she wished to be remembered. Not as a missionary, not as a reformer, not as a writer, but as a mother to the forgotten. In her final days, those around her described an atmosphere of deep peace. Hymns were softly sung, scriptures were gently read. Her breathing grew slower, her eyes often remained closed, yet her lips moved in whispered prayers. And then, quietly, without struggle, Amy Carmichael stepped into eternity. She had lived 86 years, 56 of them in India, more than half a century poured out for others. Her departure did not bring despair. It brought reverent awe, because everyone knew they had witnessed a life fully surrendered. But death did not silence her voice. If anything, it amplified it. Her books continued to circulate, her story continued to inspire. Her rescued children continued her work. Her legacy expanded far beyond anything she had imagined. Even today, more than a century later, her words still challenge believers across the world. Her life still confronts comfortable Christianity. Her sacrifice still raises the question, What does obedience truly cost, and are we willing to pay that price? Amy Carmichael did not change the world through power. She did not shape history through influence. She transformed lives through surrender, and in doing so, she left a legacy that time itself cannot erase. But the true power of her story is not found in what she accomplished. It is found in what she chose, again and again and again. She chose obedience over safety. She chose sacrifice over comfort. She chose faith over fear. And in that choice she revealed the extraordinary beauty of a life fully given to God. Yet, there is one final truth her story teaches, a truth that reaches beyond history and speaks directly into our lives today. Because the question her journey leaves us with is not about her, it is about us. And that question leads us into the final chapter of this story. And now, the question remains, what do we do with a life like hers? Amy Carmichael's story is not meant to be admired from a distance. It is meant to confront us, because her life exposes the tension between comfort and calling, between safety and surrender, between a faith that is spoken and a faith that is lived. She had every reason to choose ease, a respected family, a promising future, security, yet she laid all of it down, not once, but daily, not for fame, not for recognition, but for love, for obedience, for Christ. Her life reminds us that true faith is rarely convenient. It stretches us, it disrupts our plans, it pulls us beyond what feels safe, and yet it leads us into something far greater than comfort could ever provide. Because comfort fades, security shifts, but obedience echoes into eternity. Amy understood something many never grasp, that a life fully surrendered to God is never wasted. Not a single prayer, not a single tear, not a single sacrifice. Nothing given in faith is ever lost. Every unseen act of love is remembered. Every quiet moment of obedience is recorded. Every costly choice carries eternal weight. And perhaps that is why her story still speaks so powerfully today. Because deep within every human heart is the longing for a life that truly matters. A life that goes beyond survival, beyond routine, beyond comfort. A life that leaves a mark, a life that counts. Amy Carmichael did not change the world by becoming powerful. She changed the world by becoming available to God, available to suffering children, available to go wherever she was sent, available to give whatever was required. And through that availability, God did what only He can do. He turned surrender into salvation. He turned obedience into deliverance. He turned sacrifice into transformation. Her story reminds us that the greatest impact often happens in hidden places, in unseen moments, in faithful choices no one applauds, but heaven sees, heaven records, and heaven rejoices. So today, her life quietly asks each of us, what are we holding on to? What comfort are we protecting? What fears are we allowing to limit our obedience? And what might God be inviting us to surrender? Because the same God who called Amy still calls, still sends, still invites, and still transforms lives through ordinary people who dare to say yes. You may never cross oceans. You may never rescue hundreds of children. But you can live surrendered, you can love sacrificially, you can obey faithfully, and in doing so, you participate in a story far greater than your own, a story that stretches beyond time, beyond death, beyond this world. Amy Carmichael's life proves that one surrendered soul can echo through generations. And perhaps the greatest tribute we can offer her is not admiration, but imitation, a life that chooses Christ no matter the cost. Because in the end, when comfort fades and titles disappear, only one thing remains, a life poured out for God. And that is a life that truly lives. Her story reminds us that true greatness is not found in comfort, wealth, or fame, but in surrender. If this story touched your heart, Stay with us. Subscribe now and join a growing community that keeps these powerful testimonies alive. Leave your like. It helps this message reach more people than you imagine. And share this video, because someone out there may be waiting for exactly this story. And now we want to hear from you. Which Christian hero, martyr, or missionary should we tell the story of next? Leave your suggestion in the comments. Your idea might become our next video. Together, we are telling stories that change lives.